Hi, Nicole. How you doing?
Hi, I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm all right. I'm all right. Thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing. And donations are still coming in, but please keep on donating. So thank everybody for sharing their time. We have Nicole Hoffman, that is a threat researcher at Shadowscape. And I'm gonna shut up and leave the stage to this fantastic girl. Thank you.
Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, perfect. Are you able to see my presentation? Perfect.
Yeah, stage is yours. Thank you for coming.
Oh, okay. So once again, thanks everyone for being here. I know where I am, it's pretty late, so I really appreciate you taking the time. My name is Nicole Hoffman. I'm giving a presentation on applying fraud detection techniques to hunt adversaries. Just to introduce the topic a little bit more, I am going to be speaking a lot about financial crimes and fraud detection, but it is first and foremost a hunting story. So if you're interested in threat hunting or you're interested in getting into the field, stick around because it's going to be a great story. So just a little bit of background on myself. I am a threat research analyst currently at Shadowscape. I've been in the field for about 2 years. I'm currently a senior in college, pursuing a bachelor's in information technology. Early in my college career, I was a fraud analyst for a financial institution. When I'm not working, I am usually doing CrossFit or kayaking or spending time with my family. So just to go over the agenda, I am going to give some background on financial crimes and the life of a fraud analyst. And then I'm going to be going over some pain points that led me to a more proactive approach in the hunt. And then I'm going to be applying those methodologies to the cyber domain. And just as a note, anytime I mention the name Carol, just know that she's the adversary. It was just easier to give her a name for this scenario. So there's a lot of different types of financial crimes that fraud analysts are responsible for detecting in their environment. Credit card fraud typically occurs when there's a card skimmer on it's typically on a gas station, or people steal credit card numbers from a POS system and sell them on the dark web. All of that is included in credit card fraud. Check fraud could be anywhere from stealing checks, forging signatures, printing your own checks, check kiting, which we're going to get into in a little bit, or writing a check on a closed account is considered check fraud. Money laundering is considered cleaning dirty money, which is essentially taking money that has been obtained illegally and trying to make it seem like it has a legal origin, like through a legitimate business. Terrorist funding is pretty straightforward. Any terrorist funding is considered a crime, and it is a fraudulent act. Embezzlement, anytime someone is put into a place of trust for an organization's funds, such as an accountant, a chief financial officer, if they misuse those funds or steal those funds, it's considered embezzlement. When I was a fraud analyst, while I did try to detect all of these different types of crimes, I mainly focused on check fraud. And a lot of people don't know the path that a check takes after it's deposited. So I wanted to go over that because a lot of adversaries like to take advantage of that. So it's kind of important for the presentation. So I don't know about you, but when I was little, my grandma used to give me a check every Christmas for $5, and she would stick it in my stocking. And so in this scenario, I'm the receiver of the check, so I would be the payee, and my grandma would be the payer who wrote the check. So I would deposit the check into my bank. My bank would process the check and send it to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve would then send it to my grandma, the payer's bank, and request the funds. If the funds are available, her account would be debited. And if the funds were not available, then they would send a response back through the Federal Reserve. And then the Federal Reserve would process those funds and send it to my bank account. And the amount of time it takes for me to deposit the checks and either receive the funds or the message that there's no funds available, that's known as the float, and it's the time period. And a lot of adversaries take advantage of this time period that we'll get into in a little bit. So my department in fraud was very understaffed. We had very little resources. We didn't have a lot of tools. It was a smaller organization. And half my day was spent reviewing hundreds of check deposits. Every check that was deposited into the organization had to be checked manually for fraud. And I had to make sure I didn't need to place the check on hold to cover the float time if, say, they didn't have the funds to cover the check. If the check, I had to ensure the check was a legitimate check and not a fraudulent check. I also had to make sure there wasn't a forged signature. And so it could be a very daunting task, manually staring at thousands of checks, and you really only have a certain time period that you can spend on each check. And when I was done with that task, then I went into reviewing potential fraud alerts. And fraud alerts are very similar to the alerts that you would see as like a SOC analyst. There's a lot of false positives, and it could quickly lead to fatigue, or excuse me, alert fatigue. And the reason being is because, you know, you're spending so much time chasing these false positives when you really want to be spending time doing your job that you were trained to do. And it can get really defeating. So I really wanted to start doing something different. Something had to change because, you know, my mind was already going crazy reviewing all these checks, and then to go into alerts with the same amount of due diligence, it was just, I felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. So the first thing I did was review our current tool set. I was a little bit more technical than the other people in my team, and so I knew there was a lot in the tool that we weren't using. So one of the things that I noticed that had been turned on already for a while, and I think maybe they had forgot about it, was a machine learning feature that tried to make a baseline of normal user activity. And I started reviewing those alerts, and it was great. I was actually able to identify a few fraud activities, but then I realized after informing my team about this new feature, I increased my workload, which then increased my false positives. So now it was like I was reviewing 3 alert sets, and it just wasn't enough. I still felt like we could be more proactive. So I decided to narrow our focus and focus just on one specific crime, which is check kiting, because we are very familiar with this crime and it happened quite often. So bringing Carol into the story to discuss what check kiting is, let's say Carol has 2 bank accounts. She has an account at Bank A and an account at Bank B. Both accounts have $0. However, Carol decides she's going to write a check from Bank A for $200. She's then going to deposit the check typically into the ATM, making the balance now $200. And then she's going to take the funds immediately out, and then she'll get away with the money. The reason she's able to do that is 2 reasons. She's taking advantage of the float, and the reason she's immediately allowed to take the cash out is because of the Expedited Funds Availability Act, which says that the first $200 of checks have to be made available the next day, or typically most institutions will make it right away. And so when you see check kiting, it's typically in $200 increments because of that. And the best example of check kiting that I've ever seen, if you've ever heard of the movie Catch Me If You Can, it's a true story. It has Leonardo DiCaprio, and he plays the character Frank Abagnale Jr., and he was a master of deception. He's 71 today, and he's still an informant for the FBI. But he started as a check hider when he was a teenager, and then he progressed into printing his own checks, and then he progressed into creating identities to go with the checks. And it was very exciting. He at one point he pretended to be a doctor, a pilot, a prison guard. He ended up serving about 5 years when he was caught out of a 12-year sentence, and they made him work for the FBI for free, identifying fraud to get him out of it. So if you haven't seen the movie, I highly recommend it. Or he has a lot of books out. He still talks about fraud to this day. Great guy. So thinking like a fraudster, I first wanted to make sure, I wanted to write down, we're focusing on check kiting. What do we know? I wanted to talk about everything we know about check kiting, all the techniques. We know that they typically use the ATM. We know that they typically do it in $200 increments. And we know that usually it is a newer account. So these are all things that we saw from previous incidents. So I wanted to start asking, how would I do it? Like, I have a knowledge about the inner workings of the organization, and I wanted to start thinking, how would I commit this crime and get away with it? And then I started asking my coworkers, how would you do it if it was you? And they'd say, yeah, I mean, I would do it that way, but like Carol's not going to know to do it this way because she doesn't know about our inner workings. But if you think about it, what if someone inside the organization is committing this crime? So I think it's just as important to think about how you would do it with your knowledge set, as well as how would Carol do it? How has Carol been doing it? And so it's important to not only know what she's doing in the wild, but look at previous incidents and take that information under consideration. So we started our hunt. We had some common characteristics that we found from our own knowledge and from previous incidents in the organization. And we found a ton of check kiting activities. And so we had all this data, but we have to analyze it because I wanted to make sure if, I saw a lot of connections between Carol and other people. I didn't know if she's working with a group of people, as if is there lone wolves, or is it a combination? So I decided to make an adversary profile on each individual person that we saw in our results from the hunt. And what I did was I basically just made an Excel spreadsheet with every single person that was involved, all the checks that they had written, all of the ATM activity, who they're writing checks to, and each person that they wrote a check to that was a check kiting activity. I documented everything. And then I started doing a little bit of analysis on the behaviors leading up to the event that we were able to find. Was there any red flags, anything that could lead us to earlier detection? And what I found out was a lot of these people were repeat offenders. They started out with smaller amounts, and then they increased their amount to the 200, and some of them even got up to 500. So we looked at all of that, but it was becoming too much in Excel. So we decided to just start visualizing it with connections. And there's a lot of data visualizations tools available that I'm aware of now, but we were thick in the hunt. I didn't want to lose traction. So we literally just took out a piece of paper and started writing it down. And it looked a lot like this. We soon realized Carol was at the middle of this. She was definitely leading everyone and showing everyone how to do it. I wasn't sure if she was taking advantage of people or if they were willing. That wasn't something we were able to find out. But at the end of it, we did discover a group of about 40 people, 35 to 40 people who were a part of this fraud ring, and we were able to give that information over to the authorities. And then we found out that we weren't the only ones involved. There were other financial institutions that were victims to the same group of people. And so I realized, had we had some kind of communication set up, or an open line of communication to share fraud indicators or advice, or these are the names that we're seeing, we could have saved the organization a lot of money or even prevented a lot of the fraud that happened. So when I moved into cybersecurity, I realized that a lot of the methodologies that I used as a fraud analyst could be applied to the cyber domain, and specifically hunting adversaries, because at the end of the day, we're both hunting a person with behaviors and patterns that you can identify. So the first thing, I found was the most useful as a financial fraud analyst was knowing my environment, being aware of all the policies and procedures that people take advantage of, knowing where they're going to do it. And in cybersecurity, that means mapping your network, knowing what your assets are, knowing where the path that they're going to take, what are they after? And that goes into cultivating an adversarial mindset. You want to be aware of how someone's going to do it. And in financial fraud, the motive is it's financial gain. But in cybersecurity, there could be a load of different motives. It could, it could be a hacktivist. It could be someone that's, looking for financial gain. There could be a lot of different scenarios that happen. So it's really important to be aware of the techniques and the tactics and procedures of adversaries in the wild. But remember, we talked about, I think it's just as important to take your knowledge of how you would do it and build your adversary profiles that way as well. And then the number one thing that I learned that really helped me in our specific hunting scenarios was having a process and documenting everything. When you're in the hunt, you're going to think that you're going to remember that guy. Oh, there's that one guy who's connected and he did that thing, but you're not going to remember. You have to document everything. And if you're working with law enforcement, that really comes in handy to be able to provide that to them. And without the processes, you can't just go looking for APT 28 and think that they're going to be hiding under a rock in your network somewhere. You got to have the right processes to be able to identify all of the things that are going on, because a single indicator of compromise is just one tentacle of a larger campaign. And without the processes and documentation to rein in the chaos, you're not going to be able to find all of the tentacles. You're not going to be able to find what it means, who it's connected to. So that is really important. And post-incident activities, what I mean by that is after a security incident happens, start analyzing the behaviors, if you can find them, that led up to the point of detection. Look for red flags, anything that could have led to earlier detection. And then also, document those lessons that you learned. Document the techniques that you're seeing in your environment, because that information is extremely important. And then start small. Start hunting with adversarial or with known indicators of compromise. You don't want to go looking willy-nilly, because you're going to go down a rabbit hole. You want to stay focused. And automation is just an aid. There is no substitute for human-driven analysis. And that's something that I've learned as a fraud analyst and as well as a cybersecurity analyst. Automation has its good parts, but when you're thick in the hunt, and a computer's not going to see those gray areas and see that lateral thinking that my team was able to make. And then the visualization really helps me be able to see the connections and make correlations between events and indicators of compromise. And then, like I said, if we would have had that open line of communication with other financial institutions, we would have been able to either prevent the fraud from happening or just detect it earlier, which saves the organization, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I think all of that can definitely be applied to the cyber domain, and you can have a successful hunt. So I know this is a lot to look at, but I wanted to inspire anyone that's currently in threat hunting or anyone that's thinking about making any of this actionable. So I'm going to make these slides available for download after, so you can go ahead and see that later, so you don't have to jot it all down now. So in conclusion, I wanted to shine light with this presentation on how similar the two fields are. With fraud detection and cybersecurity, the two fields can really learn from each other, because at the end of the day, you're both hunting people, and they both have patterns and behaviors that you can identify. And I really hope that it can inspire other people to get into threat hunting. It doesn't have to be super complicated. You'd be surprised how much you already know about your environment and how that information can really tie into your hunts. So don't take that information for granted. And, don't forget that, you don't just want to look at what is happening in your environment and what's happening in the wild. You also want to take your own knowledge into consideration, because you might be able to identify an insider threat with that information. So it's important to document all of that information. So I hope you liked my presentation, and thank you so much for watching.
Thank you very much, Nicole, for this wonderful one. So let me see if we have any question going on. So what do you have any anecdote or anything? So how did you decide to move all of a sudden from a traditional financial fraud to the security field? What was the real driver?
Sure. So I was actually already in my degree. I had already picked information security. So when I was already working in the financial institution, and then there was a position that opened up as a fraud analyst, and I thought, it kind of hopefully would give me ready for cybersecurity because they're both, hunting adversaries, and I just thought it would be really fun to try to identify different fraud because I saw it in the position that I was already in within the organization.
I've been in that position, so I know what you mean for being. It's really close, and I've been working with investigator on both sides, so it's kind of similar field and really different field aside, but the technique are kind of similar. And what did excite you in one job and the other? What did you like and what didn't you like in one side of the fence or the other side of the fence?
Well, one specific thing is I noticed in cybersecurity, it's a lot easier to shut things down. When it's someone's bank account, you can't just, let's just shut it down. You could be wrong, and then they don't pay their mortgage, and then you get fired. So that's one of the, and then people use the Expedited Funds Availability Act. That's not something we have the power to change. And certain things in cybersecurity you can't change, but ultimately there's a lot of things you can. There's a lot of rule sets that you can put in place, and there's a lot more flexibility.
And anything you will take from one area to the other and the other way around. So from traditional fraud investigation to cybersecurity in terms of regulation, or the other way around, or technique.
I actually think both fields can really learn from each other, and I think they should learn from each other more. I haven't been in the fraud industry in a little while, so I don't know how far they've come, but I know there's a lot more fancy tools than what I had access to. And that's one of the reason that the fact that I didn't have a lot of resources, I'm actually grateful for, because I actually have a lot more analysis. I'm a huge analytics nerd. I understand, life without automation and fancy tools, and, getting down in the weeds and just, doing it myself. And that's something I'm grateful for.
No, that's amazing. So we have the next speaker coming up in a few minutes. But any kind of advice you want to give to people? I mean, like you, that they came from one field and decided all of a sudden to say, "Oh, there is an opportunity in security." Like a developer is kind of the traditional path, but other people might be or might find not as easy to transition to security field. So any last suggestion?
Well, the great thing about cybersecurity and all its sectors is a lot of the information is readily available and open to the public. So if you have the drive to learn, most of it is freely available. And I've found that the community is extremely inviting, and most of my learning has been from mentors in the field, and just it's just my own personal drive to learn and get my hands dirty with different tools. And it's great how many open source tools are available for the community to learn and grow.
Thank you very much for sharing. And can I share from deep down my heart, thank you for coming online. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for mentoring, because I particularly mentor a lot of people, and keep on doing that, keep on sharing, keep on mentoring other people, because it's the way to attract other talent like yourself to this field. So I'd like you to thank very much, and I'd like to introduce